I've been driving trucks for more years than I care to count. It's the kind of job that gets into your bones, you know? Endless nights on the road, miles of nothing but asphalt, trees, and the occasional flickering streetlight. But there are some nights, some stretches of road that stick with you. This one night, I was on a lonely stretch of highway Route 66, to be exact. It was late, almost 2 a.m., and I was heading down an isolated part of the road, the kind where the only company you have is the hum of your engine and the sound of your tires eating up the miles. The wind was picking up, and there was something in the air, like it was holding its breath. I was about 2 hours into the run when I saw him, a figure standing by the side of the road, waving his arm weakly in the distance. It was strange because there was no town for miles, and I hadn't seen another soul for the last hour. I slowed the truck down and leaned over to the passenger side to get a better look. He looked odd. His clothes were ragged, and he had this pale, almost ghostly look to him. The light from my headlights barely caught him, but I could make out the outline of his face. His eyes were dark, almost sunken, and the corners of his mouth twitched like he was trying to smile but couldn't quite manage it. I had been driving long enough to know better than to pick up hitchhikers, but there was something about him. Something that felt familiar, like I'd seen him somewhere before. I slowed the truck down and rolled down the window. "You need a ride?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man took a step forward, his feet dragging through the dirt. He nodded, but didn't say anything. I hesitated for a second. There was something unsettling about his silence. But then again, the road was empty. He wasn't asking for much. I motioned toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." He climbed in without a word, sitting silently next to me. As the truck rumbled back to life, I could feel the coldness of his presence, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees the second he'd sat down. I glanced at him, trying to make conversation. "Long night." He didn't answer right away, just stared out the window. I tried again. "Where you headed?" "A place up north," he murmured, his voice raspy. "I've been here before." Sounded strange, but I didn't push. Maybe he was just tired. I focused on the road, the headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to roll in from the woods. The silence between us grew thicker. I had the distinct feeling he wasn't really there with me. Not in the way you'd expect someone to be. After a while, I caught him glancing at me from the corner of my eye. His face was half in shadow, but I could see his lips moving, like he was speaking to himself. The words were faint, too faint for me to catch. Something about them felt familiar, like echoes of a memory I couldn't quite reach. I thought about asking him what he meant, but then I noticed something strange. The air in the cab had gotten colder, almost icy, like I had driven into a freezer. I turned up the heat, but it didn't help. My breath was visible now, fogging up the windshield. "Hey, you all right?" I asked, trying to mask the chill creeping into my bones. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine. For the briefest moment, I felt something I can't explain. A coldness that went deeper than the air. Then, just like that, he smiled. A slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was as though the smile had been forced, stitched on, out of place with the rest of his face. "I'm going home," he said. The truck hit a bump in the road, and when I looked over, he was gone. Gone. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, my hands trembling on the wheel. There was nothing. No sign of him, not even a trace. The passenger seat was empty, the door still closed. I pulled over to the side of the road, my breath quick and shallow. The truck's engine sputtered as I tried to collect myself. The air felt thick, suffocating. I glanced around, my eyes darting to the shadows creeping across the road. But there was no sign of him, no sign at all. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, faint but sharp. I could almost taste it. I didn't know what to do. Should I turn back? Was I losing my mind? I sat there, my fingers clenched around the wheel, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I finally drove on, trying to shake off the feeling of his eyes still watching me from the dark. But it didn't help. The next morning, I stopped at a small diner to grab a cup of coffee. I hadn't said a word to anyone about what happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had been in that truck with me. I mentioned the road I'd been on to the waitress. She paused, then looked at me with wide eyes. "You picked up a hitchhiker, you say? On Route 66. "Yeah," I said, swallowing hard. "Why?" "You're not the first one," she said, her voice quiet now. "That stretch of road, it's known for strange things. People pick up hitchhikers out there, but they never seem to get anywhere. You know about the crash, right? The one from years ago." I shook my head, the blood draining from my face. "That hitchhiker you saw? He died in a car accident right where you picked him up. His car swerved off the road, went up in flames. They say he never left that spot. Some people think he's still out there, waiting for a ride." My stomach dropped, and the diner seemed to grow colder. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. The man I had picked up wasn't just some lost soul. He was a phantom, a memory of the past, still trapped in that desolate stretch of highway. And the worst part? He was still out there, waiting. I've driven across some of the most desolate roads in the country. I've seen stretches of highway where the only thing you hear is the hum of your tires, the wind pressing against your truck like it's trying to push you off course. But there was one road, one night that still haunts me. It was late, too late if I'm being honest. I had been on the road for over 15 hours, and my eyes were starting to feel the weight of the miles. The route I was taking through the mountains was unfamiliar. I had a delivery to make, but I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. It was supposed to be a shortcut, but as the night dragged on, I realized just how badly I had messed up. The fog rolled in so fast that I didn't even have time to react. 1 second, I was cruising through the mountains, and the next, I could barely see my headlights cutting through the mist. The temperature dropped sharply, making the air feel like it was pressing in on me. It was the kind of fog that swallowed up everything, nothing but an endless wall of white outside the truck. I reached for the GPS. No signal. Of course. Typical. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a temporary glitch. I've been down roads like this before, unfamiliar and unsettling, but I knew if I kept driving, I'd find a way out. But the minutes stretched into hours, and the road, it didn't seem to change. The fog didn't lift. The truck's headlights illuminated nothing but white, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I glanced at the clock. What had felt like hours had only been 45 minutes. My heart started to beat a little faster. Something wasn't right. I had to keep going. I had no choice. Couldn't stop. And yet, with every mile I drove, the fog seemed to grow denser, heavier. It wasn't just the mist anymore. It was like the entire mountain was closing in on me, trying to trap me in its grip. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance. An old street lamp barely casting a glow. There had to be something there, some sort of town. Maybe a place to stop, to get directions, or just to breathe for a minute. I steered the truck toward the light. As I got closer, the fog seemed to thin out, just enough for me to make out a small, run-down town at the base of the mountain. The buildings were old, some of them dilapidated, with cracked windows and peeling paint. There were no cars, no signs of life, just the eerie, haunting silence of a place frozen in time. I parked the truck and stepped out into the cold night air. It was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of animals, no wind, no distant chatter. Just the dull thud of my boots against the cracked pavement as I walked towards a building that looked like a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the fog. I pushed the door open. The bell above it didn't ring. It just swayed, creaking softly. Inside, it was dark, with the flicker of old fluorescent lights overhead. The air was thick, musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Behind the counter sat an old man. Gray hair, a weathered face, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he didn't look surprised to see anyone. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice raspy but calm. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I got lost on the mountain road. I can't find my way back. How far is the nearest town? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, like he was trying to decide if he should say something. After a long moment, he leaned forward. "You won't find your way back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not tonight. It's already too late." The words sent a chill straight through me. I wasn't sure if he was being cryptic for the sake of it or if he actually meant something more. But I needed to know. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then he said, "The town doesn't exist for much longer. After tonight, it vanishes, just like it always does." The words didn't register at first. I thought he was just rambling, some old man caught in his own weird world. But as I stood there, a sense of dread began to crawl under my skin. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt it. Something was wrong. This town, this place, it wasn't real. Vanishing? What do you mean it vanishes? I asked, my voice more forceful now. "This is a real town, right?" The old man nodded slowly, then stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for a small notebook behind the counter. He slid it toward me. "Look at the dates," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The town has been lost for decades. Every year it comes back, and every year it disappears again. You can't escape it. No one has." I opened the notebook, my eyes scanning the faded pages. There were dates, lists of people, names that didn't mean anything to me. But as I flipped through, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Every date listed was from the past. Some of the entries were decades old. The most recent one, a week ago. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow colder. The light overhead flickered and went out completely. A low, unsettling hum filled the air, and I felt it. Like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting. I rushed to the door. When I opened it, the fog had returned. But this time it was thicker, more suffocating. I could barely see the truck parked out front. I didn't waste another second. I jumped back into the cab, trying to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. I glanced up, and that's when I saw it. The town, silent, dark, was gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of mountain road, the fog curling around the truck like fingers, pulling me back into its grasp. Silence was oppressive. There were no sounds, no signs of life, nothing. I was completely alone on that road, but somehow, I wasn't. I slammed the door shut and tried the engine again. This time it roared to life. My heart pounded, and I slammed the gas pedal down, desperate to get away from the emptiness that had swallowed the town. But the fog, it was different now. It wasn't just surrounding me. It was moving with me, pushing against the truck, as if trying to drag me back. And then, in the distance, I saw something. It wasn't the town this time. It was a figure. An old man standing in the middle of the road. His clothes were ragged, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were empty, hollow, and his lips barely moved as he stared at me. I didn't slow down. Couldn't. I swerved to avoid him, and for a split second, I thought I saw a faint smile cross his face before he vanished into the fog, just like the town. I didn't stop driving until I hit the first town I could find. When I pulled into the truck stop, I tried to ask the locals about the road I'd been on, the fog, the town, but none of them knew anything about it. The town I had seen didn't exist. Weeks later, I tried to retrace my steps. I went back to that mountain road, hoping it was all just a bad dream, a twist of my tired mind. But there was nothing. No fog, no town, not even the road I had driven on. That's when I realized. The town, it wasn't meant for me. It wasn't even meant for anyone alive. The people there, the old man, they weren't just stuck in time, they were trapped. And now I was too. I will never find my way off that mountain. Every year that road will come back for me, and I will have no choice but to follow it, into the fog, into the town that vanishes every night. And I'll wait for the next lost soul to pick me up, just like I was once. Hi, my name is Thomas. I had driven this road dozens of times, but tonight felt different. The jungle pressed in around me, the trees thick and menacing, their twisted branches casting long, distorted shadows on the road. The air felt heavier, thicker than usual, like something was watching me. I could feel it, deep in my gut, like the ground itself was alive and breathing with me. It was late, too late to be out here, but the job had to be done. I wasn't exactly thrilled about taking this route, but I didn't have a choice. The usual shortcut through the mountain pass was closed due to a landslide, and this jungle road was the only other option. As I gripped the wheel tighter, the faint hum of my truck's engine was the only sound I could hear, until the radio crackled to life. "Slow down." The voice came through, frantic and sharp. It was a man's voice, strained and urgent. "There's a curve ahead. A bad one. You won't make it." "I can't." Then the transmission cut off, leaving nothing but static. I leaned forward, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel. What the hell? I had driven this road so many times. I knew it like the back of my hand. But there was something in the voice, something raw, desperate, that made my pulse race. I glanced at the road ahead. The fog was starting to creep in, thin tendrils weaving through the trees, swallowing up the headlights. I couldn't see far, but the curve the voice had mentioned? It was coming up. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't the type to panic easily, but that voice couldn't shake it. I eased off the accelerator, slowing down as the truck crawled through the mist. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass without clipping each other. I made the turn, careful, keeping my speed slow, trying to keep my eyes sharp. That's when I saw it. A flash in the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the road, too fast to be a person, too solid to be just the fog. My heart skipped. I gripped the wheel tighter. Suddenly, the truck lurched. The tires hit something slick, something other than the smooth asphalt. The back of the truck fishtailed, and for a second, I thought I was going to lose control. My stomach flipped, and I threw the wheel to the left, the tires screeching, the engine roaring as I fought to regain control. The truck skidded, but somehow I pulled it back in line. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. I had just narrowly avoided a crash, probably the worst one I'd ever seen. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back, even though the night was suffocatingly hot. I stopped the truck, just for a moment, to steady my nerves. My heart was racing. I stared ahead at the curve I had just passed. It looked perfectly fine now. The fog was rolling in thicker, like it had a life of its own, but there was no sign of what had just happened. No wreck, no signs of danger, nothing. I grabbed the radio's mic and tried to call out. "Hello? Anyone out there? This is driver 492. I heard your warning. Did anyone catch that?" The static came back, but no voice answered. Only the eerie hum of the radio, that constant, unsettling buzz. Shaking my head, I hit the gas again, trying to put the incident behind me. But every time I looked out the window, the trees seemed to get closer. The road twisted like a snake, and it felt like I wasn't moving forward, just deeper into the jungle, deeper into something I couldn't quite place. I reached the nearest town a while later, feeling the weight of the drive settle on my shoulders. It wasn't a big place, just a few houses and a gas station. I pulled in, desperate to get out of that truck and stretch my legs. But as soon as I walked into the diner at the edge of the town, the conversation turned in an unexpected direction. The old man behind the counter, a regular I'd seen before, looked at me with a knowing gaze. "You're the one who passed through the jungle road tonight, huh?" he asked, his voice low, almost like he already knew the answer. I nodded, and he took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "Dangerous stretch of road, that one. A lot of truckers don't make it through. It's cursed, they say. You've heard the stories." I didn't know what to say. "Cursed?" He nodded. "Yeah. A trucker died on that same curve years ago. Went off the road in the fog, just like you nearly did. They say his spirit still tries to warn people. Somehow, he's still trying to save them from the same fate." I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. That voice on the radio. Could it have been him? The trucker who had died there? I didn't want to believe it, but a part of me couldn't shake the thought. What if it was real? I spent the night in the town, but I couldn't stop thinking about the curve, the warning. The next morning, I took a different route out of town, avoiding the jungle road entirely. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the rearview mirror. Months went by before I found the courage to drive that road again. The fog still rolled in, thick and suffocating, and I had to slow down at the curve. But this time, when I passed it, when I drove through that same stretch of jungle, I saw something in the corner of my eye. Just a flash, but enough to make my blood freeze. It was the same shadow I had seen the night I nearly crashed. But this time, it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure, a man in a trucker's uniform, standing at the edge of the curve, staring at me with hollow eyes. His mouth was open, as if screaming, but I couldn't hear anything. He vanished as quickly as he had appeared, just as the fog swallowed him whole. I never drove that road again, and to this day, I'm haunted by that voice on the radio, warning me of the danger ahead. Because I know now, it wasn't a coincidence. The warning wasn't just an echo in the static. It was real, and there are some places, some roads where the dead don't let go.